Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program, and we're a little different than other programs. Stop being polarized. How are we going to stop being dysfunctional? How are we going to get government working again? For those of you that have seen the show before, you know that my pet issue, of course, is we need an effective third political party. I just don't think anything changes until we have an effective third political party. And one of the questions is always, well, how are you going to get there? How are you going to have an effective third political party? And a subset of that conversation always comes down to voting. When the election is getting tight, people start telling people, you can't vote for the third party candidate, you're going to ruin the election, you're going to throw your vote away, your vote's no good, don't do this, blah, 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 blah. Now, I don't happen to believe that, but there are a lot of people working on some answers to this problem, not necessarily from the third party angle, but just from the respect that our voting system, is 200 and some years old. Maybe we could get into the 21st century. Maybe we need a new system. Maybe we could be better. We've done a previous show on something called ranked choice voting, which they're now using in the state of Maine and some other places. And today we're going to talk about something called approval voting. It's a little twist on the same thing, but again, getting you to think about ways to fix the system and maybe ways to improve the voting system. We're going to talk today with Aaron Hamlin. He's the executive director of the Center for Election Science. Now, how cool is that? The Center for Election Science. Makes you just want to go there and, see what they do, I guess. Center for Election Science. I love the title. So we're talking to Aaron, and they've got some very fresh perspectives on our voting system, how to fix it, and how to get us out of this dysfunctional, polarized world we live in. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nima.
So the Center for Election Science, I said, what a cool name. What is election science anyway?
So at the Center for Election Science, basically what we do is we study and advance better voting methods. Studying methods includes doing some of our own research. Right now we're collaborating with some folks from the Paris School of Economics, working on a paper from data that we got during the 2016 elections. And we also advance better voting methods. So we're also running a ballot initiative with a local organization in Fargo to get approval voting on the ballot. So these are the types of things that we do.
So you were one of the founders of the organization. Before we talk about approval voting and some of the things you're doing, tell us how the organization got started and how it's organized, and more importantly, how you make your decisions, how you decide what causes you're going to advance. How does that all happen?
Sure. So the Center for Election Science, I think a lot of the people that became from the founding board started from a Google forum, and a lot of those participants were people who had a mathematics background, some kind of political science or engineering, computer science background. And we had this place where everybody was talking about these ideas, but there wasn't a structure there. And at the time, I was in law school, and I had seen what was going on, and I recognized that the structure was needed. And so I played that part in terms of providing that structure to have some key members from that original group, bringing them together to form a board and incorporate it to a nonprofit organization.
And how long have you guys been around?
We incorporated in 2011. We got our nonprofit status in 2012.
So you said this is a very mathematical-oriented approach to elections. And that's what I was saying, how do you go about making your decisions? So how do you guys communicate? How do you study your theories? And then how do you make decisions?
So it's challenging in terms of figuring out what an appropriate voting method is for a particular context. So we can look at how a voting method performs on average in conditions that we expect to happen. And there's also a matter of looking at the necessity of bringing in new software for the voting method. How adaptable are the people running the election to changing the ballot design? So these are the types of questions that we have to consider when looking whether to advocate for a particular voting method within a particular context.
And you mentioned you're working on a project in conjunction with some economists in Paris. I take it voting science is really not a U.S. issue per se. It's people are feeling voting issues around the world.
That's right. Actually, in France, the leading researchers there who have done studies comparing different voting methods, they've done it in multiple of the recent elections. And with this particular collaboration that we're working on, we're analyzing data from that we took in the 2016 election for the presidential election, and we looked at candidates who were in that race as well as candidates who could have been in that race, and we asked respondents to ask how they would vote according to 4 different voting methods.
So do you have a goal, in other words, do you have a set premise of what you're setting out to achieve here in terms of what would be your ultimate win, if you could define that?
So what we do is we look at figuring out what voting method works for a particular context, and we have all sorts of tools that we use in order to figure out how to do that and which voting method makes sense. And then being informed by that information, what we do is we carry out a plan for actually getting these better voting methods implemented. And the way that we do that is we start at the local level, collaborating with another local organization, and through a ballot initiative, implement one of these alternative voting methods that we see as being far superior to whatever the status quo is for that particular locality. And then we replicate that to other cities, and then we build up to scale that up to even larger cities, and then take that to the state level.
So as I mentioned in the beginning, the approach that you guys favor is called approval voting, correct?
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about approval voting and how that works.
Sure. So approval voting is classically a single winner election. And so normally when you go to vote on a single winner election, past the post, also called plurality voting, and it has a host of problems with it. The difference between plurality voting and approval voting is that when you go to the voting booth in an approval voting election, you're not forced to choose just one candidate. You can choose one candidate if you want, but you have the option to select as many candidates as you want. And you're not ranking, you're merely selecting as many candidates as you want. And the candidate with the most votes wins. It's a very simple voting method. It's additive. You're just adding up the number of approvals per each candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. But even with that voting method being so simple, it has a bunch of nice properties to it, particularly compared to what the status quo is with plurality voting.
Yeah, and let's step back there, because I do want to spend more time talking about approval voting. What is it you don't like about plurality voting? What do you think is not working right now?
So you can look at it at both, like, just conceptually at the fundamental level, and then just seeing the direct side effects that come out of it. So with plurality voting, one way to look at it is you can't offer any less information than you do with plurality voting. So you're forced to choose just one candidate, and you can challenge yourself to try to figure out a way to offer less information than that, but you can't do it without leaving your ballot blank. So you're hardly offering any information, and the information that you are offering often isn't very good, because often plurality voting puts you in this dilemma where you're afraid of throwing your vote away. So the first question you normally ask yourself under plurality voting is, well, is this person that I'm voting for, is this person viable? And that's not really a good question in terms of getting a good candidate, because viability doesn't necessarily translate to that candidate being good in office. Typically, when we think viability, we think of that as, like, does this person have money? Does this person have name recognition? And those things don't necessarily translate to doing a good job. So plurality voting puts us in that dilemma. You can also have vote splitting with plurality voting. So if there are a bunch of candidates that you really like and you'd like to support all of them, well, you can't do that with plurality voting. You're forced to choose just one. And as a consequence, the support for that slate of candidates who are similar and agree with your ideology, that vote divides. And so you can lose in that type of election, even if that ideology that you have shares very popular support. And you can lose there just because an opposition to your ideology doesn't have their vote split, because maybe they just have one candidate. And support for ideology just can come out almost randomly sometimes. You have candidates who even bring in a little bit of a small support, and they can wind up tossing the election to somebody else just because of their entrance. So plurality voting just kind of, it really just fails underneath the most minor of hurdles with any kind of competition within an election.
And now my roots are in Chicago, and there's some pretty sophisticated vote swindling that goes on there. And one of the tried and true methods is, if, let's say, you're in an election and your candidate has a certain profile, your opposition candidate has a certain profile, you try and put more people like that on the ballot. So let's say you're a man and you're running against a woman and you want to split the woman vote, you try and convince other women to get on the ballot, and therefore the man maybe gets more votes than all the women. Your system defeats that strategy, correct?
That's right. Yeah, and that's healthy democracy. We want competition. And fortunately, with approval voting, it encourages that competition because people aren't afraid to run and get, like, there's no fear of being labeled as a spoiler when you're running under an approval voting election, because if you're, say, running as a woman and there are other women running, you don't have to think like, well, like, should I be running? Is that other person going to be a stronger candidate than me? Are we going to split the vote? We don't have to worry about that, because if you have a similar slate in terms of ideas and ideology and what you bring to the table, and you share the same kind of support base, approval voting allows that support base to support both of you.
And this goes to, as I said in the beginning, I'm a third party guy. A lot of people may want to vote for a third party candidate, but they're maybe afraid to sometimes, or they get kind of abused into or embarrassed into not voting for the third party because they're saying they're throwing their vote away. This way, you could walk in, you could vote for a Democrat and a third party. You could vote for a Republican and a third party. And that way, there's no argument at all about throwing a vote away.
That's right. Approval voting has this nice property to it, which allows you to always support your honest favorite candidate, no matter what. It never harms you in any circumstance. And that's really awesome for third parties. So what we see in research looking at third parties where approval voting is implemented, we consistently see third parties perform much, much better under approval voting. Now, that's not to say that a third party wins. The nature of a third party means that it's smaller and it's trying to grow. But when you have approval voting being used and you have this much more accurate reflection of support for third party candidates, because people aren't afraid to throw their vote away, it creates a different election dynamic. So with an approval voting election with third parties present, you have candidates, when they bring good ideas to the table, they can't be marginalized when they're getting these higher support levels. And that's important, because having a healthy democracy is about being able to introduce new ideas and having them get the opportunity to either succeed or fail.
So you said this is being used in other...
It's being used in often a number of mathematical organizations within, I guess, quasi-government. The United Nations uses approval voting to elect a Secretary General. And we're right now working to get approval voting implemented in its first U.S. city, in the city of Fargo, which, for context in terms of where approval voting has been in this timeline, academically, approval voting has been studied since the late 1970s, which that research, the formal research originated with Stephen Brams, a political scientist, and Peter Fishburne, a mathematician.
So let's talk about Fargo then, because obviously you're engaged in an active campaign right now to get it approved. Similar to, as I said on the show, in the state of Maine, they had a campaign to get ranked choice voting approved. So you're involved in an active campaign. How hard is it for you to sell it, and what arguments are you making to sell it? And conversely, I assume you have opponents. So what are the opponents doing to attack you? How's that working out?
Fortunately, we haven't really faced much opposition in Fargo. So the way Fargo started was there was an earlier election in Fargo where they happened to be electing one commission seat at the time, and there were a number of candidates, and the winning candidate had less than 25% of the vote. So it was pretty strange in terms of election, and that raised a lot of eyebrows. And so the city decided to create an election task force And one of the members of that election task force had reached out to us, Jed Limke. And Jed Limke, and after discussing with us, really caught on to approval voting and really became supportive of it. And then sharing that information with the rest of the task force, much of the rest of the task force got on board as well. And so they kept trying to push to the commission that this was a good idea and that the commission itself should put it before the voters. Well, the commission decided not to do that. And as a consequence of a number of public meetings, having opportunity from public support, much of the public support was positive, that just the commission wasn't putting it on the ballot. And so as a consequence, Jed said, all right, well, this needs to happen. This is what the people want. This is what the task force wanted to put in front of the people. And so we need to make sure that happens if the commission isn't going to be able to let us do that. And so after that, Jed formed a local organization called Reform Fargo, and that organization became the spearhead for pushing approval voting in Fargo. And so we're helping them with doing the education campaign, technical support, and ultimately trying to make Fargo the first city to use approval voting. So far our impression is that the incumbents prefer the status quo method. And that's not surprising. It's you would expect the people who are already elected in office would prefer to keep using the voting method that got them there. And so there's an inherent conflict of interest there. Just like people who are elected shouldn't choose the voters who are going to be voting on them next time, like for instance with gerrymandering, the people in office also really shouldn't have a say in terms of the voting method that's used to elect them as well because of that conflict of interest. But we don't have to allow that conflict of interest. We can circumvent that. And the way that we're circumventing that is by using a ballot.
As our turnouts are so abysmal, do you have a sense that this type of voting, approval voting, would actually increase turnout as well?
Potentially. It's hard to say. I mean, that's something it's an empirical question. So, I mean, we can test that over time to see whether that's the case. Interestingly, with voter turnout, we could also see voter turnout as a proxy for the confidence that voters have in the election. So right now, we're giving voters literally the worst voting method as a tool to decide who represents them. And so it's not that surprising that voters aren't amped up to vote when they're given this really terrible tool to vote with. And so if I suspect that once approval voting becomes more well-known and is utilized more, voters can see the power that they have that they didn't have before with priority voting. And given that, I think that would motivate a lot more voters to go out there and exercise their right to vote now that the right to vote is much more meaningful than it was prior.
So obviously, you know, elections are run by local officials. They've bought machinery in that context.
As easy as it is for approval voting, switching from plurality voting to approval voting is probably the easiest switch there is in terms of switching to a different voting method. You don't need special software. You're simply making it so that the voting machine allows you to select more than one candidate. That's the only change. And having it in the directions be clear to the voter that the voter can support all the candidates that they wish.
So on a prior show, when we did talk about ranked choice voting, it's a little more complicated, I think, to explain because you rank your votes and then the machine does a series of simultaneous equations to figure who the winner is. You don't have any of that with approval voting. It's much more simple in that regard.
That's right. And some of the opposition, I think, that ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting has faced in the past are accusations of it being complicated. Well, if someone were to try to say that approval voting was too complicated, they'd basically have to convince people that voters aren't able to add. And that's not very complimentary.
So let's say there are 7 people in the race. Can you vote? I know it wouldn't make sense, but can you vote for all 7? Can you vote for only 6? Vote for 5? I mean, do you have limits on how many votes you can cast?
You can choose as many candidates as there are running. So technically, like you just mentioned, if there were 7 people running and you chose 7 people, I mean, it's the equivalent of not voting at all because
Correct.
you
Right.
effectively cancel yourself out. But you could. I mean, you can, by voting for all 7, you could say, you know what? I think we've done a fine job this election getting candidates. I think all these candidates are fine. I don't really have any strong preferences between them. Go ahead. I support them all.
Now, another, problem with voting, as I said, is turnout. And some systems require everyone to vote. For instance, Australia. Do you think a system like that lends itself more to approval voting because everybody's going to come out and vote, or does that not make a difference?
I think there's the issue of using a particular voting method and that incentivizing people to go out and vote. And that's a little bit different than compulsory voting. I think the issue with the issue with voter turnout, when it really becomes an issue, is when the people who do go out and vote aren't representative of the electorate as a whole. So just like, say, like within science, when we're trying to figure out what a population of people, what they look like in some kind of way in terms of their ideas on a particular subject, we often do sampling in order to figure out what that overall population looks like. But we don't go and ask every single person. We use statistical methods in order to figure out what that population looks like by only looking at a subset. So the idea that not everybody votes is not a big deal, but it does become a big deal when the people who do vote aren't representative of the electorate as a whole. So that becomes more of the issue.
Now, obviously, one of the hot topics in politics these days is whether or not the Russians interfered in our election last time around. Seems to me approval voting, in a way, makes it more difficult for someone to interfere in an election, because if I'm the Russians, I may want to interfere because I know it's either going to be Clinton or Trump. But I don't know how many presidential candidates were on the ballot last time. Probably was about 10 or 15. If there's 10 or 15 of approval voting, I think it makes it harder to interfere.
Yeah, so I think having that, having all that competition is healthy, but you're right, it does interplay with a lot of other factors as well. So when you have a number of more candidates in the race, like those are more people you have to deal with. Those are more wild cards. And the same thing really interplays with public finance, finance too. So right now, if there are only 2 people running, you can push for one particular person and you have a bit more of a sure bet. Or if you want to hedge your bets, you can give money to both of those candidates. But if you're using approval voting and it's encouraging a bunch more people to come out as candidates and run in these elections, and they're good candidates and the race is close, well, in those elections, it's much harder for people who are trying to influence elections with money, for instance. So there they have to deal with more candidates, and it gets really expensive much more quickly. And so having more candidates or having a voting method like approval voting incentivize more candidates to run really has a number of ancillary effects that are overall beneficial.
I like that. I like everything you guys are doing. Tell my viewers how they can find you. Let's say they want to learn more about the Center for Election Science. They want to get involved in Fargo. They want to get involved in some of your next steps. How do they find you? How do they get active?
The best way to get the ball rolling in terms of activity is to go to our website. You can go to our website. It is electionscience.org. And from there, you can sign up for our newsletter. And we send our newsletter at the end of every month. And so we also have social media. So we're also on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So you can find all of our up-to-the-minute stuff on there as well when we send out updates.
And there's a couple of cute little videos people can go and watch about the blueberry running against the peach, running against the squash or something like that too, right?
That's right. We do have a particularly cute video that explains approval voting.
Well, Aaron, I certainly want to wish you well. This is exciting stuff. I know, really, somewhat to a certain extent, it's in infancy. We've got ranked choice voting out there, and I think we're going to get a breakthrough one of these days, whether it's approval voting or ranked choice voting, one of these systems, and people are going to just see how easy these systems work and all the benefits that come with them. So I wish you well in the future.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to see what will happen this November in Fargo to see if it becomes the first city to use approval voting.
All the best. We've been talking to Aaron Hamlin from the Center for Election Science, and I don't know, I'm kind of excited myself. I hope they win in Fargo, and then we'll have a sample from Fargo of how approval voting works. We're going to have some samples from Maine of how ranked choice voting works, and I think people are going to catch on and like this stuff. I guess just from my simplistic sense here, approval voting makes a little more sense to me, but I guess both systems make sense to me because of all the advantages they bring, and if nothing else, I'm the third party guy, and anything that will start that conversation, increase the debate, get more people running for office, as Aaron just said, all these are good things. So take a look at the website, get active, follow Fargo. I think maybe we'll do a show with Aaron after the election. We'll talk about how things went there. Hopefully they're going to go well, and we'll just see. I didn't ask him if he had any polling, but maybe I should have, see how things are expected to come out there. Thank you for watching. Our goal is always to educate, and we always want to entertain. And remember, we want solutions. We want to fix this system. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.